The 19th Tennessee Infantry Regiment, or 19th Tennessee Volunteer Infantry Regiment, was an infantry regiment in the Confederate States Army during the American Civil War. The 19th Tennessee fought in every major battle and campaign of the Army of Tennessee except the Battle of Perryville. First Lt.Robert.D. Powell of Company K, killed at the Battle of Barbourville, Kentucky, is believed to be the first soldier killed in the Civil War outside of Virginia. The 19th Tennessee was formed from companies of men from the counties of East Tennessee and was mustered into the Confederate Army at Knoxville, Tennessee, in the spring of 1861. Beginning the war with a force of over 1,000 men, only 78 soldiers were present when the 19th surrendered. 58 of the remaining 78 soldiers were from the initial muster at the beginning of the war. The remaining 20 soldiers had joined the regiment later. The regiment was encamped at Greensboro, North Carolina, when the Army of Tennessee surrendered on April 26, 1865. The 19th Tennessee's regimental flag was not surrendered to the Union Army, and its final disposition and whereabouts are unknown. The Antebellum period in East Tennessee. The state of Tennessee consists of three major divisions: East, Middle, and West Tennessee. The geography of Middle Tennessee consists of rolling hills, and West Tennessee is generally flat. But East Tennessee has some of the most rugged terrain in the Appalachian Mountains. The rugged terrain of East Tennessee hampered the development of agricultural land in the region, and delayed the development of roads and railways, while obstructions in the Tennessee River below Chattanooga hampered the development of water transportation, making it difficult for East Tennesseans to bring any products to markets. Thus, the agrarianism of the region was limited to food production rather than the production of cash crops. This began to change with the completions of the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad in 1855, linking Knoxville to Georgia, and the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad in 1858, linking Knoxville to Bristol. With the completion of these railways, farmers in East Tennessee could finally transport produce, primarily hogs and corn, to Virginia and the Deep South, and a new cash crop emerged in the region's economy: wheat. By the mid-1850s, wheat production in the region had risen by 300%. With the increase and development of agriculture in East Tennessee, there was a corresponding increase in the slave population of the region during the decade of the 1850s, some 21%, as opposed to an increase of only 14% in the white population, while only about one-fourth of Southerners, as a whole, could afford to own any slaves at all, and the majority being owned by the wealthiest 6%. Only about 10% of East Tennesseans were slaveholders. Though Tennessee had a strong Union loyalist coalition, with East Tennessee having a particularly strong Unionist presence. In the months following South Carolina's secession, the coalition soon began to splinter. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion in the South left many of Loyalists feeling betrayed. With most Loyalists feeling betrayed by Lincoln, secessionist leaders quickly moved to exploit the shift in public opinion. On April 25, 1861, only 13 days after General P.G.T. Beauregard's Confederate gunners opened fire on Fort Sumter, Tennessee's legislature met to consider the question of secession. On May 6, the legislature declared the state independent from the United States. The legislature also granted Governor Isham G. Harris the authority to create a state army of 55,000 men. Though a military alliance was signed with the Confederate States of America the very next day, Tennessee's Declaration of Independence was submitted for a referendum to be held on June 8. Almost 70% of the voters approved of secession, but 69% of East Tennesseans voted against it. While Union loyalists viewed the coming war as a struggle for Republican government, secessionists saw Lincoln as a tyrant, and many citizens abandoned the old Union for the new Confederacy to remain true to the principles of the Founding Fathers. Formation of the 19th Tennessee Infantry. By the end of May, more than 20 volunteer companies met just outside Knoxville at Camp Cummings, named after David H. Cummings, a prominent farmer and attorney of the region. The 19th Tennessee Infantry was officially formed there as East Tennessee's 2nd Confederate Regiment on June 11, 1861, and Cummings was elected as its first colonel. That month, William Phipps wrote home to his sister, Charlotte, "We are the Pig Regiment of Tennessee." According to Wersham's first-person account, at the time of the regiment's formation, there were 1,012 men in the 19th's rank and file, and 48 commissioned officers, for a total of 1,060 soldiers. Organization. The original command structure of the 19th was as follows: Colonel David H. Cummings, Lt. Colonel Francis Marion Walker, Major Abram Fulkerson, Adjutant V. Q. Johnson, Sergeant Major Henry M. Doak, Surgeon Joseph E. Dulaney, ASSD, Surgeon Samuel Carson, Quartermaster Addison D. Taylor, Chaplain Rev. David Sullins, Musicians Rufus Lamb, James Tyner, and W. J. Worsham. Company A, Hamilton County, Tennessee, 97 men. Captain John D. Powell, 1st Lieutenant V. Q. Johnson, 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Kennedy, 3rd Lieutenant Frank Faust. Company B, Washington County, Tennessee, 100 men. Captain Zadok T. Zeb Willett, 1st Lieutenant Joseph Conley, 2nd Lieutenant Nathan Gregg, 3rd Lieutenant James Dedrick. Company C, Sullivan County, Tennessee, 104 men. Captain James P. Snap, 1st Lieutenant Charles Street, John, 2nd Lieutenant George H. Hull, 3rd Lieutenant John M. Jones. Company D, Rio County, Tennessee, 103 men. Captain Warner E. Colville, 1st Lieutenant Pete Miller, 2nd Lieutenant James A. Wallace, 3rd Lieutenant S. J. A. Frazier. Company E, Knoxville, Tennessee, 106 men. Captain John W. Paxton, 1st Lieutenant John M. Miller, 2nd Lieutenant J.K. Graham, 3rd Lieutenant William M. Lackey. Company F, Polk County, Tennessee, 93 men. Captain John H. Hanna, 1st Lieutenant P.C. Gaston, 2nd Lieutenant J. M. Sims, 3rd Lieutenant J.C. Holmes. Company G, Sullivan County, Tennessee, 110 men. Captain Abraham L. Gammon, 1st Lieutenant Jas. A. Rear, 2nd Lieutenant Robert L. Blair, 3rd Lieutenant James Carlton. Company H, McMinn County, Tennessee, 94 men. Captain William H. Lowry, Jr., 1st Lieutenant U. S. York, 2nd Lieutenant D. A. Wards, 3rd Lieutenant Thomas Maston. Company I, Hamilton County, Tennessee, 110 men. Captain Thomas H. Walker, 1st Lieutenant B. F. Moore, 2nd Lieutenant Warren Hooper, 3rd Lieutenant John Lovejoy. Company K, Hawkins County, Tennessee, 100 men. Captain Carrick W. High School, 1st Lieutenant Robert D. Powell, 2nd Lieutenant Sam P. Powell, 3rd Lieutenant Sam Spears. Cumberland Gap. In July 1861, the 19th Tennessee received its first assignment to guard the pass at Cumberland Gap from any attempted incursions by the Union Army from Kentucky, which remained a Union state and had declared neutrality despite the efforts of secessionists, into East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. The Gap is located at the junction of the three states and would have been a key invasion route into that region region of the Confederacy, just as it was a key migration route through the rugged, mountainous terrain for settlers moving west. In his autobiography, Rev. David Sullens, the 19th's chaplain, claims to have been the first Confederate soldier to enter Cumberland Gap. The regiment began building breastworks and fortifying the mountain pass, but was soon stricken with an epidemic of measles and mumps that nearly incapacitated the entire command. The regiment also recorded its first casualties at Cumberland Gap when a sergeant shot himself through the hand and when a box of percussion caps exploded, severely injuring Col. Francis M. Walker's hand. In September, Marge, Gen. Leonidas Polk committed one of the Confederacy's worst strategic blunders by seizing Columbus, Kentucky, and ending the state's neutrality, thereby opening the door for Union forces to move through the bluegrass state. General Albert Sidney Johnston was forced to move a considerable portion of the forces under his command to Bowling Green, Kentucky, to close the hole in his defensive line, and the 19th Tennessee, along with two other regiments, was relocated by General Felix Zollicoffer to Cumberland Ford, now Pineville, Kentucky, where they established Camp Buckner. Other regiments were brought up from the rear to reinforce Cumberland Gap. Battle of Barbourville. Union Loyalist sentiment was as strong in eastern Kentucky as it was in East Tennessee, and Zollicoffer feared that local Home Guard units might take action against his forces. On September 18, Zollicoffer sent a mixed force of 800 troops, including Companies B and K of the 19th, to destroy Camp Andrew Johnson, a Union training facility at Barbourville, KY. In a dawn attack, the Confederates surprised about 300 bushwhackers. The Unionists fled after a brief exchange of gunfire, and the Confederates took the camp and captured a meager store of supplies. Though several were wounded, only one man was killed. Lt.Robert D. Powell of Company K acquired the dubious distinction of being the first Confederate killed in the Western theater of the American Civil War. The regiment remained in Kentucky for a time, even managing a couple of successful raids to acquire supplies. But the assorted diseases that spread through the camps like wildfire were taking the tolls. By the end of the month, only about 600 men from the regiment were fit for duty. By late October 1861, General Zollicoffer was receiving reports that a Union invasion somewhere between Cumberland Gap and Bowling Green was impending. His brigade returned to Tennessee, leaving a large garrison at Cumberland Gap, and the rest, including the 19th, marched to Jamestown. Indeed, also believing that invasion was imminent, Unionist guerrillas had stepped up actions in East Tennessee, including the burnings of several key railroad bridges, but the revolt was soon suppressed by Confederate reinforcements in the region. Mill Springs. With the local rebellion under control, Zollicoffer's forces, including the 19th Tennessee, returned to Kentucky in late November to establish winter camp near the tiny hamlet of Mill Springs on the south bank of the Cumberland River. The Union's Army of the Ohio responded by sending a brigade under the command of General Alban F. Sherpf to nearby Somerset to prevent Zollicoffer from crossing the river and advancing into central Kentucky. Zollicoffer committed a potentially grave tactical error by crossing the Cumberland and established a fortified position on the north bank at Beech Grove. He had a numerically superior force on his front, and a flood-prone river to his rear. Camp Beech Grove appeared quite formidable, with the river guarding its flanks, and breastworks and chevaux de frise protecting its front. But the appearance was deceiving. The entrenchments could not dispel a determined attack, and disease was continuing to deplete the brigade's manpower. By the middle of December, President Jefferson Davis replaced Zollicoffer as commander of the Department of East Tennessee, though he remained in command of his brigade. Brigade, with Marge. Gen. George B. Crittenden, but it would be almost a month before Crittenden arrived. By the time he took command in January, the river was flooded and the brigade was backed into a tactical corner if the Yankees attacked. Before arriving, Crittenden had ordered Zollicoffer to move to the south bank, but he continued to hold his position. Union reinforcements were on the way into the area and Crittenden, having been reinforced as well, chose to attack them before the two groups could unite. His troops set out at about 11:30 p.m. on January 19, 1862, marching through mud sometimes over a foot deep. Zollicoffer's brigade led the advance out of the entrenchments intending to attack at dawn, but bad weather and muddy roads slowed their advance. They encountered Union pickets about 6 a.m. and the element of surprise was lost. The 19th Tennessee and 15th Mississippi engaged the Federal pickets in a running skirmish for a quarter of a mile. Zollicoffer's brigade reformed and pressed the attack, but the Federals had reinforced as well and the firing became more intense. The 19th and 25th Tennessee charged the Yankees and drove them back into the woods, but the attack faltered as confusion and chaos set in from limited visibility due to the rain, fog, smoke, thunder, and lightning. Nearsighted Zollicoffer became convinced that the 19th Tennessee was firing on the 15th Mississippi and, attempting to stop what he thought was friendly fire, rode toward the Union Army. He realized his mistake too late when an aide began firing his pistol at the Yankees, but Zollicoffer was killed in a hail of fire before he could escape. The 19th had begun to break ranks to follow him, but fell back in confusion after he was killed. Crittenden placed Colonel Cummings of the 19th Tennessee in command of Zollicoffer's brigade, and he attempted to correct his battle lines, but artillery support was ineffective, and the infantry's assortment of inferior rifles, including many flintlock muskets and country rifles that were misfiring in the rain and dampness, were no match for the Federals' superior 58 caliber percussion cap Enfields. At 9 a.m., the Federals fixed bayonets and charged, and the Confederate lines broke. In the retreat, the 19th Surgeon, Joseph Dulaney, refused to leave the wounded and was captured, but later released. The cold and exhausted Confederates retreated to Camp Beech Grove to dry off and prepare a meal, but the order to abandon the camp soon came. As Federal and Confederate cannons exchanged fire through the night, the troops were ferried across the river by a steamboat named the Noble Ellis. Some soldiers tried to swim and were drowned or swept away. After all the troops were on the south bank, Crittenden ordered the boat burned to prevent the Federals from following. The Confederates had to abandon the stores and had few provisions for the retreat. The troops were finally resupplied after reaching Gainesville on January 26. 2 weeks later, they moved to Camp Fogg near Carthage, then to Murfreesboro, where the brigades joined with Albert Sidney Johnston's army. Shiloh. General Beauregard was assembling a new army and requested Johnston to join him. Johnston marched his army south into Alabama while considering the offer. Along the way, some of the troops were issued new Enfield rifles, but the 19th Tennessee received reconditioned rifled muskets. Still, they were a vast improvement over the weapons that had contributed to their defeat at Fishing Creek. Johnston decided to join Beauregard, and so the 19th Tennessee, along with the rest of the brigade, left Decatur, Alabama on March 15, 1862, and arrived in Corinth, Mississippi, on March 20. The combined forces of Beauregard and Johnston became the Army of Mississippi. When Crittenden was arrested for drunkenness, he was replaced by John C. Breckinridge, and the 19th Tennessee fell under his command. Beauregard and Johnston hoped to liberate Middle and West Tennessee from Union control by attacking Major General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee at a riverboat port at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River near Shiloh Church. By attacking Grant before Buell's Army of the Ohio arrived, Beauregard hoped to defeat the two armies separately. By the time the attack was supposed to begin on the morning of April 4th, it was already 12 hours behind schedule and a cold rain began falling that turned the roads into muck, forcing Johnston to postpone until the next morning. The rain continued through the night and by the afternoon of April 5th, Beauregard's army was still not properly deployed, forcing another postponement. They finally achieved the staging positions late that night. The attack on the Federal camp opened at 5 o'clock a.m., but Col. George Manny's battalion, the 19th Tennessee, and General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry were sent to scout the Confederate rear in case Buell attempted a landing there. By 11 o'clock a.m., Manny was convinced that they were safe from Buell, so he detached the 19th Tennessee and Forrest's cavalry from his command, and they returned together to the front. As they approached Sarah Bell's field, Manny was approached by Marge. Gen. Frank Cheatham, who ordered him to take men of his choice and attack a Federal battery near the George Mann's cabin. Manny chose his 1st Tennessee Battalion, 9th Tennessee, 6th and 7th Kentucky Infantry, and the 19th Tennessee to attack the position known as the Hornet's Nest, with the 19th deployed on the right of his line. Manny's forces attacked the Federal position at 2:30 that afternoon, with the 19th crossing a cornfield and approaching Mance's cabin. Federal fire from the position intensified, with the 19th taking several casualties, among others, Colonel Cummings lost a finger, Marge Abram Fulkerson was shot in the thigh, and Captains Zeb Willett of Company B and Thomas Walker of Company I were killed. The Confederates stayed on the attack. The 19th stormed the cabin and took the woods to the west of the field. The 19th was released and sent back to the brigade. By 4 o'clock p.m., they had rejoined, and Breckinridge was launching an attack against the left flank of the Hornet's Nest. By 5 o'clock p.m., the nest was withering. A half-hour later, it fell. As they disarmed the Federal troops, the 19th Tennessee exchanged the reconditioned muskets for the Yankees' 58 caliber Enfields. Lt. Colonel Walker received Brig. Gen. Benjamin M. Prentice's sword in surrender. That night, the 19th Tennessee ate well from the overrun Federal camps. Some bedded down and captured Federal tents and others on the ground, but they probably slept little that night. Union gunboats fired shells into the Confederate line, starting a brush fire that burned a considerable amount of ground where the dead and wounded still lay, and nature unleashed another deluge about 10 o'clock p.m. that lasted until 3 o'clock in the morning. Meanwhile, Buell's rested army landed and reinforced Grant. Breckinridge had managed to keep his men assembled through the night, but many of the other regiments were scattered, which would cause considerable command and control problems the next morning. With the battle engaged, Grant's somewhat recovered army was exerting considerable pressure on the Confederate left flank to the west. Breckinridge had assembled his men and moved towards the Hornet's Nest, with the 19th Tennessee posted in the woods on the center right of his line, where they began taking considerable artillery fire. Federal troops advanced from the woods near Bloody Pond toward the man's cabin, but were met by intense artillery and musket fire from Burns and Stratham's brigades, including the 19th Tennessee. The Confederates counterattacked, but Federal artillery stopped their advance. The Yankees pressed again, broke the Confederate line, and captured a battery of Washington artillery. The rebels rebels rallied in the woods and charged again to recapture the cannons, with the Crescent Regiment of Louisiana engaging the Yankees, hand-to-hand. Breckinridge asked who could aid them, and Lt. Colonel Francis Walker replied that the 19th Tennessee could. The 19th charged into the fighting with other elements of Stratham's brigade and pushed the Federals back, retaking the artillery battery. The 19th Tennessee Infantry reenactors have an emblem of cross cannon barrels on the regimental flag, signifying this action. By noon, the Confederates were losing momentum and the lines starting to give way. Near Duncan Field, the 19th watched the Federals approach and opened fire on a regiment that had remained in column formation, and drove them back. William Tecumseh Sherman described the shooting as the severest musketry fire I ever heard. The Federals counterattacked and pushed Breckinridge's corps from Duncan Field back toward Shiloh Church. By 2:00 p.m., the entire Confederate line was collapsing in the face of superior numbers and better rested and supplied Federal troops. Breckinridge's corps organized a rearguard action and held the Federals off, allowing the Army of Mississippi to safely retreat. The next day, the corps moved to Mickey's Farm near Corinth and held the position, allowing Beauregard to organize a defense near the Mississippi town. The Battle of Shiloh was over, but at a cost of 23,000 combined casualties. Beauregard and, likewise, the 19th Tennessee suffered about 25% losses, from which the regiment never fully recovered. A journalist from New Orleans wrote, "After Shiloh the South never smiled again." The 19th Tennessee spent the next few weeks at Corinth in provost duty and reorganizing the regiment to compensate for the losses. Vicksburg. On May 22, 1862, Beauregard's army boarded trains for Tupelo as the 19th covered the withdrawal. The 19th followed on June 2 and arrived at Vicksburg on July 1. Union gunboats on the Mississippi River were starting to threaten the town, and the troops were garrisoned there as protection. The men of the 19th found the town charming, and the people welcomed the soldiers at first. Soon, the soldiers were not as welcome as food ran low, and the soldiers' presence began to draw fire on civilian positions. The soldiers' water source became contaminated and disease ran rampant, with epidemics of measles, malaria, and dysentery among others. The ranks were severely depleted by death and disease, and a number of soldiers received medical discharges. In late July, the Yankees ceased fire for the time being, and the first assault of Vicksburg was over. Later on, when the Union gunboats resumed and the town was under siege, soldiers and civilians had to resort to eating rats and mule meat to survive. Baton Rouge. The 19th Division was removed from Vicksburg and sent into Louisiana to attack Federal positions at Baton Rouge. By this time, the 19th Tennessee was a regiment in name only and could only muster less than 100 healthy men, so they were consolidated with the remnants of other regiments to form a battalion. One-third of the Confederate force had no shoes, many lacked shirts and coats, and some were almost naked. They carried no tents and had only 2 days' worth of rations in the haversacks. The heat and humidity of the march took the toll, as well as a lack of sources of clean drinking water. The men of the 19th were soon beset with exhaustion, fever, chills, and bloody diarrhea from dysentery. By the time they reached the Comatee River, 10 miles from Baton Rouge, only about 2,600 effective soldiers remained, and many of those were seriously ill. When the divisions marched on the Union positions just before dawn, fog limited the ability to see more than 20 steps, and there were not enough troops to form the standard double battle line. Still, the Confederates managed to press the attack and drove the Union Army back, but only to a prepared defensive position. The CSS Arkansas, a rebel gunboat, had been intended to provide support, but it had run aground ground. With only about 1,000 soldiers still fit to fight and having run out of water, the rebels could not risk another attack. Civilians helped gather the wounded and the dead. The Confederates occupied Port Hudson for a time, and fearing another attack by them, Union forces abandoned Baton Rouge on August 18.